It began as nothing more than a whisper, a hum in the air, a flicker on a screen that few understood. While nations built tanks, ships, and planes, a handful of scientists were building something you couldn't see. Something that didn't fire bullets or drop bombs, but could decide who lived and who died. They called it RDF, Radio Direction Finding. But soon, it would earn a simpler name, radar. It was invisible, yet unstoppable. A weapon that could see through clouds, through darkness, through deception itself. At first, the generals didn't believe in it. How can radio waves stop a bomber? They laughed. Even the pilots mocked the idea that a pulse of energy could find a plane 100 miles away. But war has a way of proving the impossible. And when it came, this invisible weapon would turn the tide of entire battles before the first bullet was even fired. Radar wasn't born in a lab of luxury. It was forged in fear, in desperation, in the race to survive what was coming. In the coming years, it would guide fleets through fog, spot ambushes before they struck, and make the enemy visible long before they knew they'd been found. The soldiers didn't see it, the pilots didn't hear it, but the invisible weapon was watching, and it would change the war forever. Before the beeps and echoes, the sky was a mystery. Fighters relied on eyesight, binoculars, and the glint of sunlight off an approaching wing. Night meant blindness. Fog meant death. A bomber could fly unseen over cities, and no one would know until the bombs began to fall. In those early years, the oceans were the same. Fleets vanished into mist. Submarines struck from nowhere. Entire convoys were lost because no one could see beyond the horizon. Commanders depended on human eyes, and human eyes failed. By the time a spotter shouted "enemy ahead," it was already too late. No warning, no detection, only reaction. Wars were fought in daylight because darkness belonged to the unknown, and the unknown was the enemy's greatest weapon. But in secret, across laboratories and workshops in Britain, Germany, America, and Japan, a new kind of vision was being born. A way to see without light, to reach beyond clouds and night, to turn invisible waves into information and transform silence into a signal. Before the beeps, the world fought blind, but not for much longer. Long before radar towers pierced the coastlines, Britain had ears, not eyes, listening for war. Along the misty fields of Dover and Kent, strange concrete walls rose from the earth. They looked like half-finished monuments, silent and massive, tilted toward the sea. They weren't for defense, they were for listening. These were the acoustic mirrors, Britain's wall of ears, giant sound catchers designed to hear the distant hum of aircraft engines minutes before they appeared over the channel. Operators pressed their heads against microphones, turning dials, trying to pick out the faint rumble of danger in the wind. It was primitive, but it worked for a time. They could hear bombers coming, but only when the sky was clear and only when it was already too late. Technology was moving faster than the echoes could travel. Sound could no longer save them. But the idea, the need to detect the enemy before he arrived, had taken root. And in hidden laboratories across Britain, a new kind of listening began, not for sound, but for signals. Invisible waves, energy bouncing off steel and wings. A vision built not from eyes or ears, but from science. The wall of ears would fall silent, but from its ashes, a new kind of wall would rise, one made of radio waves and courage. It would stretch across the coast, unseen and unstoppable. The world would soon call it Chain Home. It began with a question no one could yet answer. Can soundless waves see through the sky? In 1935, in a quiet field near Orford Ness, England, a group of scientists gathered beside a tower of steel and wires. Among them was a man named Robert Watson Watt, the radio engineer who believed the impossible, that radio could detect aircraft long before they appeared. They pointed their antennas toward the clouds. Miles away, a bomber took off. The team listened, not with their ears, but with machines. The signal pulsed, and then a faint echo. A heartbeat in the static. Proof. The sky could talk back. That single echo would change everything. Britain had just seen the first glimmer of radar, radio detection and ranging. No eyes, no sound, just invisible waves bouncing off wings of metal. What began as a flicker on an oscilloscope soon became the foundation of a new defense. While Europe rushed toward war, Watson Watt's invention grew in secret. Towers rose along the coast, each sending invisible pulses into the air, each listening for the faintest reply. Every echo meant a plane. Every pulse meant time. Time to scramble fighters, time to save cities, time to fight back. The echoes in the sky were quiet, but they would soon roar louder than any engine, because when the bombers finally came, Britain would already be waiting. By 1939, the storm was building over Europe. Britain could feel it in the speeches, in the headlines, in the silence before invasion. And along its lonely coastlines, a strange new fortress was rising, not of stone or steel, but of signals. They called it Chain Home, a wall of invisible power stretching from Scotland to the Isle of Wight, built not to stop enemy planes, but to see them. Each station stood like a forest of towers, sending out invisible radio waves that reached far into the sky. When those waves struck an aircraft, they bounced back, a whisper across the air, a ghostly return that told operators how far, how many, how fast. In small, dimly lit bunkers, women and men in headphones listened to the rhythm of the beeps. Dots on green screens became lives, coordinates, warnings. For the first time in history, Britain could see its enemies long before they arrived. Chain Home wasn't perfect. It was clumsy, loud, and built from spare parts. But it worked. And in the coming years, it would be the difference between survival and annihilation. When war finally broke across Europe and the Luftwaffe began its assault, Hitler's bombers expected to strike unseen. But every time they rose from France, every time they crossed the Channel, Chain Home was already waiting. Invisible, silent, deadly accurate. The Battle of Britain would not be won by numbers, but by a network of towers, operators, and echoes. The world had entered a new kind of war, a war fought by invisible eyes. It was early morning, December 7th, 1941. The sun had not yet climbed over the mountains of Oahu, and the sky above Pearl Harbor was calm, almost too calm. In a small radar station atop Opana Point, two young Army privates watched the green glow of a new machine. It was one of America's first radar sets. Experimental, noisy, still half a mystery. Then, suddenly, a surge. The screen came alive with movement. A massive formation. Dozens, no, hundreds of aircraft, heading straight toward Hawaii. The operators looked at each other. It had to be an error. No training mission was that big. Still, they reported it. A simple phone call to the information center. The officer on duty listened, paused, and gave a calm reply. "Don't worry about it. Probably a flight of B-17s coming in from the mainland." And so they watched, powerless, as the largest air raid in American history slipped beneath the radar, literally and tragically. Minutes later, the first bombs fell. Battleships erupted in fire. The sky turned black with smoke and rising sun banners. The radar had seen it all coming, but no one had believed it. That morning, radar could have changed history, but the warning was missed, and 2,400 Americans paid the price. Yet from the ashes of that mistake, a new understanding took hold. Radar would no longer be dismissed as a curiosity. It would become a weapon, a shield, and a guardian. The tragedy of Pearl Harbor wasn't only a loss, it was a lesson. A lesson that from now on, every echo mattered. The smoke from Pearl Harbor still darkened the sky when America began to ask the hard questions. How could an entire fleet be caught off guard? How could hundreds of aircraft slip past a system designed to see them coming? The answer was bitter. Radar had worked, but belief had failed. And so, overnight, everything changed. From Washington to California, from universities to shipyards, a new war began. Not of soldiers, but of scientists. Laboratories that once built radios and refrigerators were suddenly drafting blueprints for survival. The U.S. Army Signal Corps, the Navy's Bureau of Ships, and newly formed research centers raced to perfect the technology that could prevent another Pearl Harbor. They called it the radar revolution. Thousands of young engineers, many barely out of college, were handed a mission: make radar smaller, faster, more reliable, and put it everywhere. On planes, on ships, on submarines, on trucks rumbling through the jungle. America wasn't going to be blind again. Factories that once built cars now produced radar sets. Women on assembly lines soldered wires that would one day guide fleets through fog and darkness. Every new model improved on the last. Clearer screens, sharper echoes, longer range. What began as an experiment became an empire of detection. Every pulse of radio energy was a promise that the next attack would not come unseen. Radar was no longer a secret. It was a symbol of awakening. America had learned the lesson, and soon the enemy would learn theirs. Across the world, as bombs fell and engines roared, another battle raged. One fought in silence, inside laboratories, bunkers, and workshops. It was the race for radio eyes, a contest to control the invisible battlefield of the air. In Britain, the scientists of the Radar Research Establishment refined the chain home network, turning defense into precision. In Germany, engineers worked in secrecy, building radar systems to guide their night fighters and track Allied bombers over the Rhine. In Japan, naval scientists tinkered with their own devices, believing they were closing the gap. But across the Atlantic, America had awakened, and it was racing ahead faster than anyone imagined. At MIT, Harvard, and secret bases scattered across the U.S., brilliant minds gathered under a single goal: to turn radar from a static warning system into a mobile weapon. They built sets small enough to fit in planes, powerful enough to guide ships through darkness, and sharp enough to find a single bomber in a sky full of echoes. Engineers called it microwave radar, a discovery that shrunk antennas from towers to dishes and made detection faster, clearer, deadlier. Every nation tried to keep its breakthroughs secret, but in this invisible war, spies, code breakers, and captured equipment traded knowledge faster than bullets. Each improvement could tip the balance. Each failure could cost thousands of lives. Radar was no longer just technology, it was strategy. The race for the radio eyes had begun, and whoever mastered it would rule the skies.
Hidden behind the brick walls of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a revolution was taking shape, one that would never fire a shot, yet would help win the war. They called it the Radiation Laboratory, though it had nothing to do with radiation at all. It was a name chosen to confuse spies, a disguise for one of the most secret and ambitious projects in history. Inside, the best minds in physics, men and women from Harvard, Caltech, Bell Labs, even Europe's exiled scientists, worked side by side in total secrecy. Their mission? To make radar small enough for planes, fast enough for combat, and sharp enough to change the course of the war. They invented new frequencies, pushing beyond radio into microwaves, shorter waves that could pierce through storms and darkness with pinpoint precision. Every week, new breakthroughs. Every month, new prototypes. Oscilloscopes flickered through the night as engineers turned equations into instruments, and instruments into life-saving machines. In 1941, their work bore fruit. The cavity magnetron, a British invention refined by MIT's engineers. It unleashed a radar beam 1,000 times more powerful than anything before it. Suddenly, radar could see submarines beneath waves, bombers above clouds, and ships beyond the horizon. The Rad Lab, as they called it, became the beating heart of the Allied scientific war. Its discoveries guided convoys, protected carriers, and made the darkness itself a weapon. By war end, MIT's radiation lab had developed more than 100 radar systems, employing over 4,000 scientists and engineers. Few of their names were known, but every pilot, every sailor, every soldier owed them their lives. The lab's work remained invisible, just like the waves it mastered, but its echoes shaped the future of warfare and the very world beyond it.
While the scientists of MIT's radiation lab worked in quiet secrecy, their inventions were already crossing oceans, destined for a battlefield where they could decide the fate of nations. In the Pacific, the U.S. Navy faced a terrifying reality: endless open water, invisible enemies, and skies that could rain death without warning. Japanese planes struck from the clouds, vanishing into the horizon before anyone could see where they came from. Convoys were helpless. Carriers were blind. Every battle was a gamble with the unknown. But then, the secret arrived. Packed inside metal crates marked electrical equipment, new microwave radar sets were quietly installed on the bridges of destroyers and the decks of carriers. Only the officers with clearance even knew what they were. When the first radar blips appeared on the glowing screens, sailors stared in disbelief. They could see aircraft miles away before even a lookout could spot a speck in the sky. They could watch storms roll in, track torpedo boats racing through the dark, and follow enemy fleets hidden beyond the horizon. At night, when the Pacific turned black, radar became the fleet's new set of eyes. The Japanese still relied on the human eye, theirs strained against the dark. America now had the advantage of the unseen. In the Battle of the Solomon Islands, a Japanese task force sailed confidently under cover of night. They thought surprise was theirs, but American radar had already drawn their positions, their bearings, their ranges. When the U.S. Navy opened fire, it was as if the ocean itself had turned against Japan. They never saw the danger coming, not until their ships were burning. Radar had changed the rules. It wasn't just a tool, it was a new kind of warfare, one fought by invisible waves, by minds that could see what eyes could not. And from that night on, the Pacific would never be the same again.
They were the elite, the sword tip of an empire. Their training was brutal, their discipline unmatched, and their faith in their own skill was absolute. From China to the Philippines, from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, they struck first, struck fast, and vanished into the clouds before the enemy even knew what happened. To them, combat was an art, precision, instinct, and courage. They believed no machine could ever replace a pilot's eyes. No technology could ever outthink a man in the cockpit. Their aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M0, was light, agile, and unmatched in its range. It danced through the sky while Allied planes struggled to keep up. Its pilots believed they could see everything, and that the Americans, clumsy, slow, and inexperienced, could only react too late. In 1942, Japanese pilots laughed when they heard rumors of Americans trying to see with radio waves. They mocked it as science fiction, a desperate trick from a nation that didn't understand real warfare. They trusted their eyes, their instincts, and the endless horizon that had always protected them. But what they didn't know was that the sky itself was about to betray them. Soon, unseen pulses would paint them on screens miles away. Their element of surprise would vanish, and the hunters of the Pacific would become the hunted.
Darkness once meant safety. For centuries, night was the pilot's greatest ally, a cloak that hid fleets, bombers, and squadrons from any enemy eye. But now, the rules of the sky were changing. It started quietly, a faint hum in the air, a strange green glow on the screens of secret Allied outposts. The British had shown what radar could do over the channel. Now, the Americans carried that invisible shield across the Pacific. From small, isolated islands, new radar stations rose like metallic sentinels. Their rotating antennas swept the black skies, turning echoes into coordinates and darkness into daylight. Japanese bombers, once invisible under moonless nights, suddenly found themselves seen. Before their engines even reached the coast, warnings flashed through radio channels. Incoming, bearing 132 degrees. Searchlights turned. Anti-aircraft guns elevated. Fighter squadrons scrambled. guided not by sight, but by signals. The Japanese pilots didn't understand. They flew higher, lower, faster, but no matter where they went, the enemy was waiting. Some began whispering the Americans had eyes in the dark. Others called it a curse, a ghost in the clouds. But it wasn't a ghost. It was radar, the new god of the night sky. From then on, no storm, no darkness, no surprise attack could hide them again. The night raids had begun, and for Japan's once invisible airmen, the sky had never felt so small.
It looked like an ordinary twin-engine fighter, sleek, silent, painted black. But inside, it carried something no enemy could see, a secret weapon that turned night into day. They called it the P-61 Black Widow, the first American aircraft built around radar. While Japanese pilots trusted the darkness to protect them, the Black Widow hunted within it. Hidden behind the glowing glass of its cockpit, a radar operator scanned the void, watching dots appear and move, tiny ghosts representing bombers miles away. In silence, the pilot adjusted course. The radar gave distance, bearing, altitude, a deadly precision unseen before in the war. Out there, somewhere ahead, a Japanese bomber crew thought they were safe. No moon, no searchlights, just the hum of engines and the whisper of the wind. Then, a shadow behind them. Machine guns flashed once, and the sky swallowed the fire. The next morning, the wreckage told the story. An enemy that could see in the dark. For the first time, night belonged to the Allies. No longer a refuge for bombers or raiders, it was a hunting ground. The Black Widow became legend among friend and foe alike. To American pilots, it was an angel in the shadows. To Japanese airmen, it was the phantom that saw in the dark.
Long before radar ruled the skies, engineers and scientists were turning bombers into laboratories. In the belly of a modified B-24 Liberator, technicians crouched beside humming consoles, screens glowing faintly green, their hands tracing the invisible world above the Pacific. This was no ordinary bomber. It carried no bombs, only wires, antennas, and dreams. Every flight was an experiment, every storm a classroom, every echo on the screen a revelation. The B-24 became the testbed for a new kind of warfare, one fought with frequencies instead of fire. Engineers from MIT's radiation lab worked shoulder to shoulder with airmen, testing how radar waves bent over the ocean, how metal reflected through clouds, and how to spot an enemy fleet long before human eyes could. Sometimes the equipment failed mid-air. Sometimes lightning nearly blinded the radar scopes. But every flight brought progress, clearer readings, faster detection, longer range. Back on the ground, the data poured into laboratories and blueprints. Each test refined the radar that would soon guide bombers, warn fleets, and guard entire coastlines. Those B-24s never made headlines, but they changed the war all the same. While others fought with bullets, these crews fought with knowledge. Theirs was a different kind of courage, flying straight into the unknown to perfect the technology that made victory possible. They called it simply the Flying Laboratory. But history would remember it as the birthplace of modern radar warfare.
It happened quietly. No sunlight, no witnesses, no warning. Somewhere over the Pacific, a radar screen flickered to life. A faint echo appeared, just a blip in the darkness. A Japanese bomber, unaware, flying home from a night mission. The operator leaned closer, calling out coordinates. The pilot adjusted course. The gunner readied his weapons. No one could see the enemy, but the radar saw everything. For miles, they tracked that moving shadow. Closer, closer. Then, out of the black sky, the target appeared, a ghost turning real. The pilot squeezed the trigger. A flash, a burst, and the bomber disintegrated into fire. By the time debris hit the sea, the radar scope was clear again. No searchlights, no visual contact, no warning. Just science turned into silent death. That night marked a new chapter in air combat. For the first time in history, a plane was destroyed by an invisible eye. From then on, radar-guided intercepts spread like wildfire. British night fighters used it over Europe. American crews used it over the Pacific. And every Japanese pilot who vanished into the dark whispered the same question before the end. How did they find us? The answer wasn't luck. It was the cold, humming power of a machine that made the unseen seen. The first kills had been claimed, and the world would never fight in the dark again.
At first, they refused to believe it. Reports from returning pilots spoke of something impossible. Enemy fighters appearing out of nowhere, anti-aircraft fire waiting for them in total darkness, bombers intercepted miles from their targets, as if the Americans could see through the night itself. Many in Tokyo called it superstition. Some said the Americans had eyes of demons. Others thought it was luck or magic. But as the months went on, the losses became undeniable. Entire squadrons vanished over the ocean. Radar-guided ships destroyed night raids before they began. Even storms could no longer hide them. Finally, Japanese intelligence officers began to piece it together. Captured wreckage, strange antennas on downed planes, intercepted radio chatter filled with coded blips and bearings. The truth was worse than magic. It was technology, a new kind of warfare that Japan had underestimated. In laboratories and hangars across the empire, engineers scrambled to copy what they could. They tested crude radar sets, built makeshift detectors, and tried to shield their aircraft from detection. But they were years behind. Every improvement they made, the Americans had already surpassed. A Japanese admiral, after witnessing radar in action on a captured Allied vessel, reportedly muttered, "This is not sorcery. It is science, and it is our defeat." The illusion was gone. The empire that once ruled the Pacific by sight and speed was now being hunted by waves they could not see. And in that moment, Japan realized it was never magic, it was the future.
Once the truth was clear, Japan raced to fight back, not with planes or ships, but with tricks of the invisible war. If the enemy had radar, then the empire would learn to blind it. In dimly lit workshops, engineers worked through sleepless nights. They tested metallic chaff, strips of aluminum dropped from planes to create false echoes. They built radar reflectors to lure Allied bombers away from real targets. Even decoy islands, inflatable hangars, and wooden fleets
were arranged to fool the American eyes. At sea, warships were painted with strange new patterns, angles designed to scatter radar signals. Pilots were told to fly low, to hide beneath the ocean's horizon, to use the Earth itself as a shield. For a moment, it worked. Radar screens filled with ghosts, hundreds of false blips dancing across the Pacific. Some Allied gunners fired into empty clouds. Some ships changed course toward nothing but waves. But radar evolved faster than deception could keep up. New filters, sharper frequencies, smarter operators. Each trick was countered, each ghost unmasked. The Japanese were fighting not just men, but a machine that learned. And the more they tried to hide, the clearer they became. By 1944, the battle for invisibility was over. The age of countermeasures had begun, but in the war of signals, Japan was already a shadow falling behind.
By 1944, Japan was desperate. Their fleets shattered, their air power fading. They turned to a new, terrible weapon, the Kamikaze. Planes no longer returned from missions. Young pilots were told to become human bombs, to trade their lives for a single American ship. And in those final, fiery months, the Pacific became a battlefield of courage and tragedy. But even as the skies filled with death, the Allies had something Japan could not overcome: radar. On every carrier, every destroyer, and every island base across the Pacific, antennae spun endlessly, casting invisible nets over the horizon. They caught everything: a single plane, a formation of bombers, even the faint echo of wings in the night. When radar screens lit up with incoming blips, alarms blared across the decks. Bogies inbound, low and fast. Gunners raced to their stations. Fighter squadrons launched before the enemy could even be seen. Minutes later, the sky erupted. The kamikazes came in waves, screaming, burning, unstoppable. But radar made the difference between chaos and control. It bought seconds, and those seconds saved thousands of lives. Even as ships burned and smoke filled the air, the radar operators never looked away. Eyes locked on the screen, they guided interceptors, tracked survivors, and watched the blips fade, one by one. It wasn't just technology, it was endurance, the unyielding will to see through the storm and not blink. The Kamikaze had turned the Pacific into hell, but radar gave the Allies something even stronger: order in the chaos. The suicide planes could strike terror, but they could no longer strike unseen.
They looked like ordinary destroyers, lean, fast, scarred by battle. But by 1945, these ships carried something more valuable than armor or guns. They carried eyes. They were called radar picket ships, the Navy's first line of vision across the endless Pacific. While carriers and battleships waited miles behind, these destroyers sailed far ahead, alone, exposed, their antennas spinning against the sea wind. Their mission was simple and deadly: see the enemy before the enemy saw them. Inside cramped radar rooms, operators stared at glowing screens, listening to the hum of electricity and the crackle of distant static. Then, a blip. Tiny, faint, but real. Contact, bearing 270 degrees. Within seconds, messages flew across the fleet. Planes scrambled from carriers. Anti-aircraft crews prepared. The floating eyes had done their job. But the price was high. The Japanese learned to target them first. Many radar picket ships never came back, hit by waves of kamikazes drawn to their transmissions. They became both scouts and shields, absorbing the fury meant for the rest of the fleet. Still, they stayed on station. Every warning they sent saved hundreds of lives behind them. Every blip on their screens was another battle avoided, another chance to survive the next sunrise. They were not just ships. They were sentinels, the silent watchers of the sea. And when the war finally ended, veterans of the radar pickets knew one thing. They hadn't just seen history, they detected it. They were the Navy's floating eyes.
The ocean was vast, too vast even for radar on ships. But America's engineers had one more idea, one that would turn its floating fortresses into floating vision. By 1945, the Essex-class carriers had become more than runways. They were command centers, signal hubs, and now, eyes that could see beyond the horizon. On their decks, specially equipped aircraft waited for launch. These were no ordinary bombers or fighters. Their bellies held the latest radar sets. Their crews trained not to destroy, but to detect. The moment they lifted off, their radars swept hundreds of miles ahead, over ocean, over clouds, beyond what any ship could see. From the skies above the fleet, they watched for the faintest echoes, a group of planes forming, a shadow moving where no friendly should be. Then the call went out. Inbound formation bearing 312, range 140 miles. That warning gave carriers time to launch fighters, destroyers time to prepare, and commanders time to plan. The radar planes became angels of awareness, circling the fleet, feeding real-time data into the heart of the Navy's war machine. To the Japanese, it was sorcery. To the Americans, it was precision. To history, it was the birth of something greater, airborne early warning. From those primitive radar aircraft, a new kind of warfare was born, where knowledge, not distance, decided who lived. They were the carriers that saw beyond the horizon, the first glimpse of the modern age, when the future of war would belong to those who could see first.
The Pacific after dark was another world. Black skies, no landmarks, no mercy. And yet, above that endless ocean, small twin-engine aircraft prowled through the night, America's radar hunters. They were the night fighters, P-61 Black Widows, radar-equipped Hellcats, modified Corsairs and Avengers. Each one carried a secret, a glowing green screen that turned darkness into targets. Inside their cramped cockpits, pilots and radar operators worked as one. The pilot's eyes never left the sky, while behind him, the operator whispered coordinates. Target, bearing 020, range decreasing. Out there, invisible in the black, a Japanese bomber droned homeward, confident that night still offered protection. But that illusion was long gone. The Americans closed in silently, guided by the invisible hand of radar. Then, a flick of recognition, a shape against the starlight, and the Black Widow struck. Cannon fire ripped through the darkness. A flash, a fall, a fireball fading into the sea. By dawn, the hunters had vanished, leaving only silence and a growing legend. Night
after night, these radar-guided fighters guarded fleets, tracked raiders, and broke the enemy's will. They defended carriers from kamikazes, escorted bombers over island strongholds, and rewrote the rules of aerial combat. No longer did the sun dictate war. Now technology did. To the men who flew them, the night sky wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity. And to their enemies, those unseen wings became a nightmare. They called them the Night Fighters, but to the Pacific's weary sailors, they were simply the angels in the dark.
June 1944, the largest carrier battle in history was about to begin. Across the blue expanse of the Pacific, hundreds of Japanese aircraft took off in waves. Their mission clear: destroy the American fleet and halt the march toward the Marianas. But this time, the Americans had something Japan didn't: a wall of radar. Aboard every ship, antennas spun restlessly, casting invisible nets hundreds of miles across the ocean. On radar screens deep inside steel hulls, operators watched the first signs of the enemy appear. Tiny blips, faint at first, then multiplying fast. Contacts, bearing 320, range 150 miles. Within minutes, the entire U.S. fleet came alive. Fighter directors barked coordinates. Helldivers and Hellcats roared into the air. Before the Japanese even saw a single ship, American pilots were already climbing to meet them. What followed would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft were detected, intercepted, and destroyed, long before they could strike. Radar-guided gunfire filled the sky, while coordinated fighter control turned chaos into precision. By sunset, more than 300 Japanese planes lay scattered across the sea. Their crews never even saw what hit them. For Japan, it was the death of their carrier air power. For America, it was proof that victory now belonged to those who could see first. Radar had transformed the battle. What once depended on eyesight and luck was now fought with timing and data. The Battle of the Philippine Sea wasn't just a triumph of skill. It was a triumph of science. And from that day forward, every commander in the Pacific knew one truth: the side with the best radar owned the sky.
By 1945, the Pacific sky was no longer empty. It was alive, a storm of invisible energy, a battlefield of signals. Every plane, every ship, every island base was sending, receiving, listening. Radar waves swept across the clouds. Radio chatter filled the air. Electronic pulses bounced off steel and water, turning the war into something entirely new, a war of detection. In control rooms from Guam to Okinawa, the glow of radar screens replaced the moonlight. Operators sat in silence, eyes fixed on blips that told entire stories. A lone scout, a squadron forming, an enemy fleet far beyond the horizon. The Japanese, too, filled the air with signals, scrambled orders, deceptive frequencies, desperate transmissions. But their messages rarely stayed secret for long. American intercept stations, tuned across every wavelength, caught whispers before they became attacks. And still, the sky buzzed, signals crossing, overlapping, jamming, echoing. Sometimes, operators couldn't tell where the enemy ended and their own transmissions began. War had entered a new dimension, one where vision was made of electricity and victory was measured in seconds of awareness. The night was no longer dark, the sea no longer silent. Everything,
From the smallest plane to the largest ship was a sender, a receiver, a reflection in the storm. For the first time in history, humans had filled the heavens with soundless light, a sky no longer ruled by gods or fate, but by men who learned to read its signals. The Pacific War was ending, but a new kind of conflict had begun, one fought not with bullets, but with waves.
By the war's final year, radar was no longer a mystery. It had become muscle memory. The operators didn't think anymore. They felt the rhythm of the screen, the pulse of the blips, the subtle tremor that meant a formation was closing in. Fighter directors barked bearings before computers could calculate. Gunners swung their barrels the instant a trace appeared. Pilots suggested course on reflex, trusting the calm voice of a man staring at a glowing scope miles away. Technology had fused with instinct, man and machine thinking as one. What began as science had become something deeper, a new kind of awareness. Radar operators joked they could see with their ears. Pilots said they could feel when radar was watching them. It was no longer about reading instruments. It was about understanding them. When Japanese aircraft broke through the clouds, no one panicked. No one searched the horizon. They already knew where the enemy was before the enemy even saw the ocean below. In the flicker of a cathode tube, human intuition met electrical precision, and together they rewrote what it meant to fight, to react, to survive. By 1945, radar was no longer just a tool. It was part of the soldier's heartbeat, part of the Navy's breath, part of the war's rhythm itself. For those who lived through it, there was no turning back. The world had crossed a threshold, from sight to signal, from instinct to innovation. And from that moment on, technology would never again be separated from the human mind.
They once ruled the skies with stealth and instinct. The Japanese pilots, trained to strike unseen, to vanish into the clouds, to become ghosts over the Pacific. But by 1944, the ghosts had nowhere left to hide. Radar saw what eyes could not, a single sweep of an antenna, and the invisible became visible. No matter how high they climbed, no matter low they skimmed the sea, the glowing dots gave them away. Every course change, every attempt at surprise, already tracked, plotted, intercepted. The element of mystery, gone. The art of ambush, obsolete. Veteran Japanese aviators returned to base shaken. They spoke of American planes appearing out of the dark, as if the night itself had betrayed them. Dogfights that once depended on vision and reflex now turned into unseen duels, won before the enemy even knew he was found. Pilots who had once laughed at radar now flew in terror of it, their radios filled with static and fear, their fuel burned faster than their courage. One ace wrote in his diary, "We no longer fight the Americans. We fight the machine that sees us." Over the Philippines, over Iwo Jima, over Okinawa, the story repeated again and again. American fighters rose before dawn, guided by nothing but signals and silence. And when the Japanese formations appeared, the hunters were already waiting. The Pacific had changed, not by numbers, not by brute force, but by perception. And in the end, the sky belonged not to those who flew unseen, but to those who could see the unseen.
By 1945, the glow of radar screens no longer stopped at the Pacific. It reached all the way to Tokyo. What began as a line of blips over the sea had become a map of an entire nation, watched from the air, tracked from the waves, and measured by machines that never blinked. High above the clouds, American bombers flew in formation, guided not by starlight or sight, but by invisible signals bouncing off the earth. Each wave, each echo, drawing a ghostly outline of Japan below. To the crews of the B-29s, Tokyo was no longer a mystery in the dark. It was a shape on a screen. Operators watched in silence as their scopes bloomed with targets. Bridges, factories, rail lines, entire districts marked by the rhythm of radar pulses. And as the signal sharpened, so too did the war's final act. Japanese defenders listened for engines in the night, but the bombers were already overhead, their course set by a beam no searchlight could touch. Every alarm, every anti-air battery came too late. For the first time in history, a capital was mapped, targeted, and struck by a weapon guided by radio eyes. To those below, the sky burned without warning, a storm that seemed to come from nowhere. But somewhere, in a darkened aircraft, an American radar operator whispered, "We've got Tokyo." What had once been humanity's blind sky was now an open book, and every page led to fire.
World War II was not just fought with bullets and bombs. It was fought with waves, invisible, silent, and unstoppable. From the moment radar was born, the battlefield expanded into the electromagnetic spectrum, a new frontier where victory depended on who could see without seeing. Every signal told a story. Every frequency was a weapon. As the Allies refined radar, the Axis scrambled to fight back with jammers, false echoes, and ghost signals. A war of trickery began, fought not with fire, but with invisible hands. American bombers carried window, thin strips of metal foil scattered through the sky, creating clouds of false radar reflections. To Japanese operators, it looked like 1,000 bombers were coming, but only a few were real. Meanwhile, on Allied ships, new warning systems pulsed to life, detecting enemy planes long before the horizon. Each ping was a heartbeat of survival. On land, radar-guided guns locked onto targets in seconds. In the air, night fighters hunted by signal alone, turning darkness into daylight. Even communication became combat. Encrypted radios battled enemy intercepts as codebreakers and engineers waged a silent war that few soldiers even knew existed. By 1945, the hum of electricity had replaced the drumbeat of war. Every battle, every strike was guided by a whisper in the ether. The men and women behind the screens never pulled a trigger, but their signals shaped the fate of nations. It was a war fought in silence, a war won by those who could listen best.
When the war ended, the world didn't slow down. It accelerated. Radar had changed everything. It didn't just win battles, it rewired how humanity saw the sky. Engineers who once hid in laboratories under blackout curtains now looked to the heavens with a new mission: to make aircraft faster, higher, and smarter. The lessons of radar, precision, detection, coordination, became the blueprint for the jet age. During the war, scientists had learned to read invisible waves. Now they use them to guide jet engines, control missiles, and track the weather. The same men who once listened for enemy echoes now built systems to navigate across continents, the ancestors of modern air traffic control.
In secret hangars and desert test sites, radar towers watched as new aircraft roared past at the speed of sound. Jet pilots became the new knights of the sky, their lives dependent on instruments born from wartime innovation. The B-29's radar-guided bombing systems led directly to the computers of the Cold War, and the radars that once watched for kamikazes soon stood guard against nuclear bombers. Out of fear came progress. Out of destruction, discovery. The world had crossed a line. From propellers to afterburners, from whispers of radio to the thunder of the jet. Radar had not just seen the enemy, it had seen the future. By 1945, Japan's skies were no longer their own. Every movement, every formation, every flight was seen before it began. The radar they had once mocked now ruled the Pacific. Invisible eyes watched from islands, ships, and aircraft, turning the vast ocean into a map of light and echoes. In underground bunkers and laboratories, Japanese engineers worked desperately, trying to build their own radar networks to close the gap that had grown too wide. But time had already chosen its side. Captured American sets revealed an impossible truth. The Allies were not just years ahead, they were generations ahead. Where Japan's crude systems could barely spot a plane at 20 miles, American radar could track an entire fleet across the sea. Where Japanese interceptors flew blind, Allied night fighters struck with surgical precision. The engineers realized what their admirals already feared. No amount of courage could overcome technology this advanced. In the final months, they stopped boasting and started studying. Every fallen aircraft, every bombed base, was now a lesson in defeat. When Japan surrendered, many of those same scientists would later admit they hadn't been beaten just by bombs or ships, but by a machine that could see the unseen. They called it the most humbling revelation of the war. And in their notebooks, written in quiet resignation, was the truth they could no longer deny. We were fighting men who could see us long before we could see them.
It began as a whisper in the dark, a flicker on a screen, a signal bouncing off the unknown. Radar, a word born in war, but destined to define the future. From the ashes of battle, it rose as something greater, not a weapon, but a window into the invisible world. It had guided bombers through storms, saved fleets from ambush, and turned the tide of wars fought across endless oceans. But its true power came after the guns went silent. Radar became the guardian of the skies. It guided airliners through clouds, tracked hurricanes before they struck, and watched over borders during an uneasy peace. From the vast towers of early warning systems to the precision scanners in every modern jet, its pulse still beats, the heartbeat of aviation itself. Every takeoff, every landing, every aircraft crossing the night sky owes its safety to that first trembling echo discovered in the age of war. The same invisible waves that once hunted enemies now protect lives across the world. It was more than an invention. It was a revelation. The invention that didn't just change the war, it changed the skies forever.